Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us, and then you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Our scripture this morning comes from the 15th chapter of Luke, the parable of the lost son, beginning in verse 11. Then Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." We're in the final week of our series. This is the last sermon of our series about house rules. And I hope that you have enjoyed it. If this is your first time to be here in this series, we've been talking about house rules. House rules are just our ways of talking about ways of wisdom and how God uses the home in order to shape us. And in each of our homes, there is special rules and examples like this one that I looked up. We hang this in the children's bathroom. It says, "If at first you don't succeed, try doing it the way mom told you to in the beginning." That's a house rule of ours. If you don't succeed, try doing it the way mom said. You may have other house rules. There's examples out on the boards. People have shared house rules, both for their individual homes and for us as a church. This is the last week. I encourage, if you haven't done so already, to go online and submit your top 6 family rules. It's a great way just to have some discussion as a family, sitting around the dinner table one night, just to talk about what are our rules and how do we live. And I've had this conversation with my own family, and it's just such a neat time to do together. When I began this series, I mentioned to a friend of mine who's a pastor what we were doing and shared with him my excitement around doing house rules. And he said, "Oh, there's this great movie that you make me think of." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's this old movie in like the late 70s called The Great Santini." I never heard of it before. He said, "Well, it's a story about this Marine officer who tries to run his family with military precision. And there's this scene," he said, "where he's walking in front of the kids who are all sitting in front of the house on the steps, and he's giving them all of the house rules. You should check it out." And I watched it, and I thought, oh, Lord, that's not at all what I was going for. House rules. It's been my contention that house rules are given in love by a loving God or a loving parent to help children understand boundaries and protect them and keep them safe, or to build character in us, to enable us to thrive and prosper in life. That's the purpose of rules. And then my friend said, yeah, I know, I get that, but you should be aware there's probably a handful of people, maybe more in your congregation, who grew up in a home like that. A home where rules were not loving, where rules didn't feel generous, where the heart behind the rules was lost, where in fact the rules were stacked up so high against them, it felt like they were doomed to failure before they ever began. You have to address that, Dave. And I don't know if any of you grew up in that kind of a home. But I think all of us have probably had at some point the experience of trying to earn our acceptance. If not from a parent, then from a demanding boss, or even from the jury of our peers. We've had to earn our acceptance, and we felt that we're only as good as our last performance was. And what happens, we saw 2 weeks ago, when we bring that need to earn our acceptance into religion, things get off. Instead of having a religion that focuses on inward compassion, we get a religion that's just focused on outward performance. One that's focused not on loving your fellow man, but on being better than your fellow man. And it corrupts our image of God. Because God isn't a father that we can approach with confidence. Instead, God is an intimidating figure. One that we would avoid for fear. Because we never felt like we would have done enough. So if that's you, if you have struggled at all during this series because of background or disposition with the notion of rules, today's story is for you. Because Jesus was talking to a culture and a society that was obsessed with rules, and in the midst of that society, he told the story of the prodigal son. Now, we find this story in the 15th chapter of Luke, what Grace and Matthew calls the lost and found department of Luke's gospel. Because it's not just this one story, there's actually 3 stories, all of which feature something or someone getting lost. In the first story, there's 100 sheep, one of which gets lost. In the second story, there's 10 coins, one of which gets lost. And then finally, there's the 2 children, one of which gets lost. You see the scale goes from 100 to 10 to 2. It keeps drilling down this series of stories to get more intimate, more personal. Grace and Matthew points out this. She says, the first story is about something that gets lost out there. The sheep gets lost out there. The second story, though, is about a coin that gets lost in here. Then she says, so it's possible to get lost inside, not just outside. And then the third story is about one who gets lost outside and one who is lost inside. You see, we call it the parable of the prodigal son, as if it was just one son who got lost. But the reality is, both sons are equally lost, just lost in different ways. Timothy Keller wrote an excellent book called The Prodigal God, just about this one single parable. And he points out that Jesus, when he begins telling these stories, is speaking to 2 different audiences. Go back to the beginning of Luke 15, and you can see those audiences represented. He says, first, you have all the tax collectors and the sinners who are coming near to listen to Jesus. But then you have the Pharisees and the scribes who are grumbling and saying, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with him. So he told them. Who's the them? It's both groups. The sinners and the tax collectors and the scribes and the Pharisees. He wanted both of them to hear these stories. And he knew perhaps that they would each react differently to the stories because they would each locate themselves at a different place in the story. So he starts with, Timothy Keller says, each son represents a different path to happiness. He says the older son, he represents what we call the path of moral conformity. That this is the path that says, the way to achieve a life of true meaning and significance, a life of true long-term happiness, is just to follow all of the house rules, to respect the community, to respect its traditions and its values. The individual on its own has no significance. The individual only finds meaning as part of the whole. And so when what the individual wants and what the community needs comes into conflict, it's up to the individual to sacrifice his or her desires and wants in order to do and serve the wider community. This is a tradition, a path that places high emphasis on duty and honor, responsibility. You can think about communities where those are the buzzwords, for instance. I know many of you served in the military. High emphasis on duty and honor, doing what you have to do, whether or not you want to do it. Amish communities. I lived for a period, my first church I served was in Amish country. High emphasis on duty and honor, responsibility. Many churches function this way too. The other path, the path represented by the younger son, Timothy Keller calls the path of self-fulfillment. People who are in this path, they kind of look around at the world and they say, oh, most of the unhappiness that exists in the world is because of these rigid communities where there's nothing but rule upon rule upon rule. That's what leads to our unhappiness. That's what leads to our problems. If we're ever going to be happy, we have to figure out who we are separate from the community. So cast off all the rules. Seek your own truth. Find your own self. Only then can you be happy. And you can probably think of communities that kind of represent that path of self-fulfillment. Woodstock and hippies, just do whatever feels right. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. Or many Eastern religions place a high emphasis on individual enlightenment, not community corporate action. I was once doing a Bible study about this, and I was having them name all the different communities they could think of that represent that path. And one person shouted out, nudist colonies. And I thought, okay, maybe that's a form of self-expression, but then I thought that maybe it's moral conformity, because if you're in a nudist colony and you don't want to, you do want to wear clothes, maybe I noodle on that. I'm not sure where nudist colonies belongs. But you have these two paths, right? And you can probably think about which one has been more dominant in your life. But Keller's point actually is that both of them end up being false paths, dead ends. Neither one leads to the promise of happiness and satisfaction and meaning. They both leave us short. He says it's easy for us to see how the path of the younger son goes astray. I mean, the younger son is this example of extreme selfishness. He says to his dad, give me my inheritance now. You may not realize it, but in that time, in that culture, to make that ask of your father, it was as if he said to his dad, I don't desire any continuing relationship with you. You only matter to me so to the degree to which I get your inheritance. I wish you were dead. That's what he was saying to his dad. And not only that, but notice, it's not like the dad, would have had all his money in a big vault like Scrooge McDuck. He couldn't just go and get the coins and say, there you go, son. It was his estate. It was his property. In order to satisfy the son's request, the father would have had to set aside a third of his land and put it open for public sale. In other words, the son's demands forced the father to make this private dispute, this fraction in the family, public for everyone to see. And so the younger son isn't just rejecting the father. He's rejecting the whole community with their norms, their ways, their values, their traditions. He's saying, I want none of this. And so he goes off and seeks his own truth. Now, you know where the younger son ends up, of course. He embraces the Gentile way of life, and he finds that he is used just as surely as he used his father. Friends are there with him when all the money's there and they can party, but when it's gone, no one in sight. And he ends up face down, taking care of pigs. Jesus says he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. Have you ever seen what pigs eat? They eat anything. And imagine in a kosher society where pigs were considered unclean, that's how hungry he was. But no one gave him anything. Perhaps you've been there at some point. I know I have. Found myself eating things that aren't satisfying. Found myself hired out to the wrong master. And all I wanted to do was go home. That's where the path of selfishness leads. You're lost. But we often miss the lostness of the older brother. I mean, if anything, for a lot of us, the older brother is a sympathetic figure, right? Haven't you ever felt that way? Like he's the one who stays behind and holds everything together. He's the one who does the duty. He's the one he deserves the credit, doesn't he? Because he would have been there when the younger brother walked away. He would have seen the hurt of his father. He would have endured the diminished capacity of the farm. No doubt over the years, he has cursed his brother 1,000 times. Every time he heard the sigh of his dad and saw his eyes on the horizon, he would have cursed his brother. Every time he had to do double duty to bring in the harvest or do the daily chores, he would have cursed his brother. And so that no good brother of his comes back, and the father gives him the ring and the robe and the fatted calf. The older brother cannot abide it. He comes in from the fields, there's a party going on, but he refuses to go in. Now, this party wasn't just a private family affair. I mean, this is the fatted calf. Perhaps the whole village would have been invited to this party because the father would have thrown the party to restore his son to that same village that he rejected. And yet the older brother stands outside in view of all of their neighbors. He is publicly shaming his dad, expressing his disapproval for everyone to see. The father comes out to him, says, "Son, why won't you come in?" Listen to what the older brother says. He says, can we put this up on the screen? "Look, all these years I have served you. I have never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, not brother of mine, son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, treated you like dirt, you kill for him the fatted calf? How could you, Dad?" And the dad responds. He says, "Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. But your brother, who was lost, has come home, and it is right for us to celebrate." "You are always with me," the dad says, "and all that is mine is yours." You could almost hear the dad pleading, "Don't you know this, son? All these years you've been with me. We've worked side by side. Didn't you know that all that time, all I have is yours?" And that's the point. The older son doesn't know it. He's missed the heart of his father. He's lost. So you have two sons separated from their father. One is separated by his sin, his selfishness, right? But the other son is separated by his righteousness, by his duty, by his obligation. How is that? Well, the younger son, he's so afraid, perhaps, to approach his father. The only way he can do it is to say, "Dad, I know I've sinned against you and against heaven. Let me be your servant." Not your son. Let me be your servant. Let me pay off the debt. I owe my father. I owe you. But the older brother, it's the opposite. He's served his time. He's put in. He's paid off all his debt and more. And so he says to his dad, "You owe me a young goat, a fatted calf. You owe me." You see, he's worked so hard to earn his place. Not just the property, but his affection, his approval. He deserves to be first in the heart of the dad. He doesn't get that the father's love and approval isn't something that can be earned. It can only be given. Andy Stanley says it this way. He says, "The word love and the word owe are often incompatible in relationship. If you get into a relationship where it's you owe me and I owe you, well, you can have that kind of a relationship, but it's a contract. It's a duty. It's an obligation, a responsibility. That's not love. Because love can't be demanded and it can't be earned. Love can only be freely given." So that diagram I just put up on the screen, look at what happens if we take out the word owe and put in the word love. This is the kind of relationship the Father wants. For each of us as his children to know in our heart of hearts, my Father loves me and I love my Father. Isn't it a difference what that one simple word substitution makes? Because it's about love, not about owing or earning. So the path of moral conformity and the path of self-fulfillment, they end dead ends. So what is the path to happiness, to meaning, to significance? It's the path represented by the Father, the path of unconditional love and acceptance. That's why Keller calls his book Prodigal God. The word prodigal doesn't mean lost. Look it up in the dictionary. The word prodigal means recklessly extravagant, having spent everything. If there's anyone who is extravagant, recklessly so in his love, it's the dad. When the son makes that demand for all of his inheritance right then, the father doesn't refuse, he gives it to him. And he doesn't even keep track of the debt. When the son returns, he runs to him as fast as he can, beating out anyone in the village who might shun him and send him away. That's the love of the Father. And when the older brother stands outside publicly shaming and disapproving, again, the Father doesn't respond in anger. He goes out to him and pleads with him to enter. He says, son, there's a party going on in here, and I want you to be part of it because my joy and my celebration are not complete unless you're there too. That's the love of the Father. The only question at the end of the parable is whether the older brother will respond. We don't know. Jesus ends the parable on that cliffhanger. Will the older brother, will the scribes, the Pharisees, will they come to the Father as well? And that's the question that is before us as too. Will we go to the Father and receive his grace, receive his acceptance, not earning it, not owing it, just receive it? I had a conversation with a member of our church, and he brought up this parable. We started talking about it back and forth, and he said, here's the thing. He said, for years, I was always jealous of you PKs, you people who never wandered very far, you people who were always in the church. I was always jealous of you and the path you took because you were never far from God's grace. And then he said, but a couple of years it dawned on me that you don't know what I know, what it's like to be far away and stuck down in the muck, to feel no good and worthless and feel God tap you on the shoulder and say, I choose you. And he said, this is his phrase, he said, it's like a bucket of grace being poured on your head. And I don't know why, when he said that word, bucket of grace, in my mind sprang this image of splash parks that I take the kids to sometimes. You ever seen those splash parks? They always have this gigantic bucket up on the top that gets filled with thousands and thousands of gallons of water. But the bucket's kind of off kilter just a little bit, off center. And so as it fills, it reaches a tipping point where then it kind of tips forward. And right before it hits that tipping point, a horn or a whistle will blow, and all the kids come running beneath, just waiting to be doused in this water. And when they do it, they splash and they laugh, and then they stay there and they wait for the bucket to do it again. And that's what church is. That's what worship is. We're God's children gathering at his feet, waiting for that bucket of grace to be poured over us again and again and again, because we never outlive our need for God's grace in our lives. So this is the end of the series. And this really hasn't been a sermon, this one, about rules, but more about the grace that's behind the rules. And I know one of our house traditions here is that we open up the altar during our time of prayer, but I'd like to open up our altar again at the end of our service today. As Frank plays our final song in a few moments, if you feel a need to come forward, I hope you do. Because maybe you have a painful past. You're just sure God couldn't love you. Lay that down. Lay that down. Or maybe you struggle with the need to be perfect, the feeling you're only as good as your last performance. Lay that down. Come. Come. Lay down your burden and be covered in God's grace.